My parents kicked me out so my golden child brother could have my room now they're old and alone. Wondering why I never came back. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I haven't spoken to my parents in almost a decade. People always ask why, like cutting off your own family must mean you did something terrible. But the truth is, sometimes family doesn't feel like love, it feels like a lifelong test you were never meant to pass. Growing up, our house looked normal from the outside. My dad worked a steady office job, my mom stayed home, and I had one younger brother, Daniel. He was the kind of kid everyone adored. Blonde hair, dimpled smile, always knew how to charm adults. My parents used to call him our little miracle. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the one who should try to be more like Daniel. When Daniel wanted a new bike, he got it. When I asked for one, I was told, "We'll see next year." Birthdays for him meant parties and balloons. Mine meant store-bought cake and a card signed out of obligation. Still, I tried God. I tried to make them proud. I studied late into the night, kept my grades perfect, did extra chores. Every report card was spotless. Every teacher loved me. But at home, that didn't matter. My mom would smile faintly and say, "That's nice, honey," before turning to Daniel, who'd just won participation in some school contest, and she beamed like he'd cured cancer. I used to think maybe if I was patient, if I worked harder, they'd finally see me. I mowed lawns to buy my own things, helped mom clean the house when Daniel refused, and even defended him when he got in trouble. But deep down, I started realizing something: cold love in our home wasn't unconditional. It was earned, traded, and rationed based on how much attention you could bring. By the time I turned 16, I stopped trying to be noticed. But that decision would cost me more than I ever imagined. I was 16 when I started noticing how the rules in our house only applied to me. If I came home 10 minutes late, my dad would be waiting in the living room, arms crossed, ready to lecture me about responsibility. But Daniel, he could disappear for hours, come back smelling like cigarettes, and mom would just sigh, saying, "He's experimenting. Don't make a big deal out of it." It got worse when Daniel wrecked Dad's car. He was 17, speeding with his friends. Showing of the car ended up wrapped around a tree. Nobody was hurt, thank God. But the moment I came home that night, my dad snapped, "You knew he was taking it, didn't you?" I stood there stunned, clutching my backpack, trying to explain that I'd been at work all day. He didn't care. Mom was crying, saying, "If only you'd kept an eye on him like a good brother." That night, I sat in my room listening to them comfort Daniel while he cried about making a mistake. My chest burned. I wanted to scream that I wasn't his keeper, that I was just a kid too. But instead, I stared at my ceiling until morning, silently promising myself that one day I'd get out. Still, I kept my head down. I finished every assignment early, worked weekends to save up, and stayed out of the way. The more invisible I became, the calmer the house felt. But invisibility cuts deep, it eats at you until you start wondering if you even exist to the people who raised you. Mom would still pat my shoulder occasionally and say, "We're proud of both our boys," but her eyes never lingered on me when she said it. I stopped correcting her. I stopped believing her. Because by then, I knew the truth. I was never the son they wanted, and I had no idea how much more they'd take from me before I finally broke. When I finally graduated high school, I thought things might change. I'd earned a full scholarship to a local university, something no one in our family had ever done. For once, I hoped they'd be proud. The day I got the acceptance letter, I ran into the kitchen, waving it like it was my golden ticket. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's good," he muttered. Mom smiled distractedly and said, "At least you'll stay nearby." But the warmth I'd been craving, that hug, that proud gleam, never came. Then Daniel walked in. Mom instantly brightened. "Guess who's thinking of joining that new gym?" she said, beaming at him. That was the moment I realized no achievement of mine could compete with his existence. Still, I tried to stay optimistic. Living at home while studying seemed practical. I told myself maybe college would be a reset button, maybe space and maturity would soften things. For a while, it even seemed true. Dad helped me move my desk near the window, and Mom cooked my favorite dinner the night before classes started. It was the first time in years I felt something like peace. But Daniel couldn't stand the attention shift, however small. He'd barge into my room uninvited, borrow my stuff, and make little comments like, "You're so serious all the time." "Relax, dude." I'd laugh it off, but it bothered me more than I admitted. One night, as I was finishing an essay, I overheard Daniel talking to MOM in the hallway. "Why does he still get that big room?" he asked. "He's barely here anyway." I froze. Mom's answer was quiet, but it cut through me. "You're right, honey. Maybe we can do something about that." I sat there in the dark, pretending not to hear, but deep down, I knew that sentence was the beginning of something I wouldn't recover from. It happened a few weeks later, after dinner. Dad asked me to stay behind while MOM cleared the table. His tone was calm, the kind that always came before bad news. "Your mother and I have been talking," he began, not meeting my eyes. "Daniel needs more space. He's growing up, and you're hardly home these days with college and work." I remember staring at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, half laughing. MOM sat down beside him, wringing her hands. "We just think it's time you start being more independent," she said softly. "You're 20 now. You should be focusing on your own place, your own life." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was paying part of the grocery bills, covering my own tuition, and still cleaning the house whenever they asked. "You're kicking me out so Daniel can have my room?" I said quietly. Dad sighed, as if I was being dramatic. "No one's kicking you out. We're just rearranging the house. You can take the basement for now." The basement, cold, unfinished, with a single flickering bulb and concrete walls that smelled like mildew. It felt like a punishment, not a compromise. "I can't study down there," I protested, voice cracking. "There's no insulation, no heat. It's freezing in winter." Dad stood up, finality in his voice. "Then maybe it's time to find somewhere else to live." I looked at them, the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and realized they'd already made up their minds long before that conversation. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by boxes, staring at the space that had been my world since childhood. Every trophy, every notebook, every piece of me was being packed away, all to make room for the son who'd already taken everything else. And as I closed the door for the last time, I could still hear Daniel upstairs, laughing. I found a small apartment a few blocks from campus, the kind of place that smelled like old carpet and instant noodles. But it was mine. For the first few nights, I barely slept. The silence felt unnatural after years of my parents' voices echoing through every wall. I'd lie awake replaying that final conversation, my mom's eyes avoiding mine while she said, "It's for the best, sweetheart." Still, I told myself this was freedom. I worked part-time at a bookstore, studied late into the night, and learned to live on cheap coffee and microwave meals. No one yelled at me for staying out late or blamed me for things I didn't do. But there was an ache I couldn't shake, the kind that comes from realizing the people who were supposed to love you most barely noticed you were gone. Weeks turned into months. Not a single call from home. Not even a text asking if I was okay. I kept checking my phone anyway, half hoping to see MOM pop up on the screen. Nothing. The closest I got was a photo Daniel sent one evening, a picture of my old room, freshly painted blue with his gaming setup in the corner. The caption read, "Looks way better now, huh?" I stared at it until my vision blurred. I didn't reply. What could I say? That he'd taken more than just my room. He'd taken every piece of belonging I had left. When graduation came, I bought my own gown, walked across the stage alone, and smiled for a photo no one would ever see. As everyone around me hugged their parents, I just stood there, clutching my diploma like proof that I existed. That night, I went home to my empty apartment, turned off the lights, and whispered to myself, "You did it." But the silence that followed didn't sound like victory, it sounded like loss. Years passed. Life slowly started to take shape, not perfect, but stable. I found a better job, built a routine, and learned to enjoy the quiet that once felt unbearable. Some nights I'd sit by the window of my apartment, wondering if my parents ever thought about me. But even those thoughts started fading with time. I told myself I'd moved on. Until one night, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Daniel. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The message was short. "Hey, can we talk? It's important." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "What's going on?" His response came a few minutes later. "Things aren't great at home. I need your help against my better judgment." I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my office. When I saw him, I barely recognized him. The once confident golden boy looked worn out, hollow eyes, nervous tapping fingers. No trace of that arrogant smirk. He didn't waste time. "I dropped out of school," he said quietly. "MOM and Dad They're not doing well. Dad lost his job. Bills are piling up. And they said you're the only one doing okay. I felt my stomach twist. After years of silence, they remembered me, but only because they needed something. So you're here because they sent you, I said flatly. Daniel looked down. They just thought you'd want to help. The bitterness in my chest burned hotter than coffee. All those years they ignored me, and now I was their safety net. I paid for my drink, stood up, and said, "Tell them I wish them the best." As I walked out, Daniel called after me, voice trembling. "You really don't care, do you?" I didn't answer. But the truth was I did care. I just finally realized I didn't owe them anything. And that realization felt terrifyingly freeing. It didn't take long before the guilt trip began. First came a voicemail from my mother, her tone sugary sweet. "Honey, it's been so long. We just want to hear your voice." Then another, a few days later, this time, tearful. "We made mistakes, but family sticks together. You'll understand when you're a parent." I didn't call back, but the messages kept coming. Sometimes she'd sound desperate, other times manipulative. "Daniel told us you've been cold to him," she'd say, guilt laced through every word. "We didn't raise you to be selfish." I used to replay those messages on my walk home, fists clenched in my pockets. Part of me wanted to scream, where was this concern when I was packing my things at 20, begging to stay until semester ended. Now that they'd lost control, suddenly I mattered. One evening, she finally caught me off guard, and I answered. Her voice cracked immediately. "We miss you, sweetheart." I took a deep breath. "Do you miss me? Or do you just miss what I could do for you?" There was silence. Then she sighed, the same way she used to when she thought I was being dramatic. "We thought you'd understand," she said softly. "Daniel needed support. You were always the strong one." That sentence hit like a slap. I'd spent my entire childhood trying to be strong for them, and that's exactly why they thought they could throw me away. I told her, "You chose him every time." "I just finally chose myself." She started crying, asking why I was being so cruel. But I hung up before I could break again. That night, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual. For the first time, I realized my family would never understand what they'd done, and maybe that was the hardest truth of all. Still, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of their downfall. The next blow came from somewhere I didn't expect: social media. One night, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw a post from an old neighbor. It said my parents had lost their house. Foreclosure. The photo showed the front yard filled with boxes, furniture, and a for sale sign. My stomach sank. I hadn't been there in years, but I knew that house better than any place in the world. Every creak of the stairs, every smell from the kitchen, it was my childhood. And now, it was gone. I messaged the neighbor, trying to stay calm. She said Daniel had been using my parents' credit cards without their knowledge, thousands of dollars in debt. When the banks came calling, he panicked, forged my dad's signature, and vanished. I just sat there in silence. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them. Another part, the bruised, tired part, whispered, "This is what happens when you protect someone from consequences their whole life." A few days later, my mother called again. This time, I answered. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "We need help," she said. "Your father's sick, and we're barely getting by. Please, you're doing well, can't you send something?" I wanted to scream, not because they were struggling, but because they still saw me as a solution, not a son. "You didn't want me when I was under your roof," I said quietly. "Why now?" She sobbed, insisting they'd made mistakes, that they were just trying to hold the family together. Then Dad took the phone, his voice still sharp despite the years. "You owe us. After everything we did for you." I almost laughed. Everything they did for me was a list that ended in exile. "I don't owe you anything," I said, voice trembling. "Not anymore." I hung up before they could respond, and for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring out my window, realizing the truth: the home I lost years ago wasn't taken by Daniel. It was destroyed by the people who built it. After that call, something inside me finally shifted. For years, I'd been carrying around this invisible weight: anger, guilt, sadness, as if holding it all somehow proved I still cared. But now that weight started to dissolve, I realized I didn't owe my parents forgiveness, explanations, or even empathy. I owed myself peace. I started going to therapy. The first few sessions were brutal. Unpeeling years of emotional neglect felt like reopening an old wound. I talk about how I used to wait for my parents' approval like it was air. How every achievement felt hollow because no one ever clapped for me. My therapist listened quietly, then said something that stuck. "You've been living your life to earn love that was never freely given." That sentence broke me, and then it rebuilt me. I started taking care of myself in ways I never had before. I went to the gym, learned to cook meals that didn't come out of a microwave, and started saving money for a future that was mine alone. I made real friends, people who didn't see me as invisible or secondary. People who saw me for the first time. My apartment didn't feel empty. It felt like home. I even started dating someone, Maya, who taught me what unconditional care actually looked like. The kind that didn't come with strings or comparisons. Still, every now and then, a small voice whispered, "You should call them, check on them." But I silenced it with the truth, and the hard way walking away wasn't cruelty. It was survival. One evening, as I deleted my parents' number from my phone for good, I felt something unexpected calm. The kind that comes after a storm you never thought would end. And just when I thought the past was finally behind me, Tama came knocking in a way I never saw coming. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. I was at work, sorting through emails, when I got a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, our old neighbor, Mrs. Callahan. The subject line read, "Your parents." For a moment, my chest tightened. I opened it, half expecting bad news, half wishing I hadn't. Her message was short. "I thought you should know your parents aren't doing well. Daniel's gone again. They've been asking about you." I sat there, staring at the screen, numb. Daniel had vanished apparently. He'd stolen what little money they had left, cleaned up their savings, and disappeared without a trace. My parents were alone, old, and barely scraping by. For the first time in years, I drove back to my hometown. The streets looked smaller, the houses older, but the ache in my chest felt exactly the same. When I reached the end of the block, I saw the house that used to be ours. The paint was peeling, the garden dead, windows cracked. The laughter that once filled it, even if it wasn't mine, was gone. I parked across the street and just watched. Through the window, I saw two frail figures sitting at the table. My mother's hair was grey now. My father's posture was slouched, defeated. They looked nothing like the people who told me to leave a lifetime ago. For a long time, I sat in the car, wrestling with the urge to knock. Would they even recognize me? Would they apologize? Would it matter? Then I noticed something that made my throat tighten. My old room's window. Still the same shape, but empty, curtainless, like a hollow memory staring back at me. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then, quietly, I started the engine and drove away, because standing at their door wouldn't have brought closure. It would reopen every wound I'd spent years healing. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't confrontation, it's silence. Driving back that night, the world outside my car felt eerily still, like time had frozen just to let me process what I'd seen. My parents' house fading in the rearview mirror wasn't just a drive away from a place, it was me finally letting go of an entire lifetime of pain. As the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't stop thinking about the irony of it all. The golden child they'd sacrificed everything for had destroyed them. The son they'd cast aside had built a life from nothing. I used to fantasize about revenge, about seeing them beg for forgiveness, admitting they were wrong. But when I finally saw them broken, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt empty. For years, I told myself I hated them. But sitting there, with the highway lights flickering over my windshield, I realized hate was just the scar tissue left behind from love that had nowhere to go. They didn't deserve my forgiveness, but I couldn't carry that anger forever. It was poisoning everything I'd built. When I got home, I pulled out an old box from my closet, the last one I hadn't opened since leaving. Inside were fragments of my past, a high school medal, a photo from my graduation, a note I'd written to myself when I was 17 that said, "One day, they'll sue you." I stared at that note for a long time before tearing it in half. I didn't need them to see me anymore. I saw myself now. As I threw the scraps away, I finally understood something. Their downfall wasn't my revenge, my peace was. They taught me what conditional love looks like. But in losing them, I learned something better: how to love without permission. And though a part of me would always ache for the family I never had, the rest of me finally felt free to stop waiting for it. But there was still one thing left to do before I could truly close that door. A few weeks later, I drove back one final time. Not to see them, not to talk, just to say goodbye properly. The air was colder than I remembered, sharp and dry. carrying that familiar smell of wet asphalt and dust that always clung to our neighborhood after rain. The old house stood there, smaller somehow, like time itself had been eroding it piece by piece. I parked across the street again, holding a small bouquet of white lilies, my mother's favorite. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked quietly to the edge of the yard and laid the flowers near the gate. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic ending, just the sound of wind brushing through the dying grass. I forgive you, I whispered, the words barely leaving my throat. But I can't come back. It wasn't for them, it was for me. For the kid who used to cry himself to sleep wondering what he'd done wrong. For the young man who believed he was unworthy of love. For the version of me who kept waiting for an apology that never came. I let him rest there, with the memories, with that old house that had taken so much and given so little. Back in my car, I looked through the windshield one last time. The curtains in the living room fluttered, and for a second, I thought I saw my mother's silhouette. Maybe she saw me, maybe she didn't. It didn't matter anymore. As I drove away, the weight that had followed me all my life began to lift, not all at once, but slowly, like a heavy fog clearing after years of darkness. They taught me the cost of conditional love, but in losing them, I found the strength to build something real. Family isn't the people who share your blood, it's the people who never make you beg to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look back.